I broke out of what I called the echo chamber a few years ago, and my eyes just opened to a lot of things. So if you and I were both at 1 calorie above our maintenance, we were both in surplus, and you ate a bunch of monounsaturated fats and I ate a bunch of saturated fat, arguably the research suggests that I am going to reduce my insulin sensitivity more than you. That's a very real thing. And I think that the low carb community should take a lesson from that, because unfortunately we have this such a dogmatic view that we're not willing to look at that. I don't want my kids to grow up and be like, oh, my dad was the one-sided guy. Like, I need to look at the bigger picture. I've got the resources now. I've got the team. Like, it would be irresponsible for me not to. I really, truly, sincerely want them to look at the internet and say wow, no, my dad was pretty even keeled and he was cool.
Welcome back to another episode of The Proof. I'm Simon Hill, your show host. Today's guest is Thomas DeLauer. Many of you may already be familiar with Thomas, as he boasts an impressive YouTube channel with a staggering 3 million subscribers and 15 million monthly views. I first encountered Thomas approximately 8 years ago when he ardently advocated for a low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet. While he certainly remains a proponent of a lower carbohydrate approach, his perspectives have evolved, now adopting a more nuanced stance that places greater emphasis on the importance of unsaturated fats and fibre, a viewpoint that we both share. The mere fact that he's been able to change his mind is something that I have the utmost respect for. Recently we connected and I found it rather intriguing to engage in a conversation with someone who follows a very different dietary path, yet maintains an open-minded and non-dogmatic approach. My hope is that this exchange offers valuable insights and helps foster a deeper understanding of diverse perspectives within the wellness sphere. Before we dive into this exchange, I'd like to kindly request that you subscribe to our channel on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, or whichever platform you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy the show, please leave a review. Your support is not only deeply appreciated, but also essential in expanding the reach of these episodes. And now, my conversation with Thomas DeLauer. Great to be doing this.
Likewise, man.
Here in Santa Monica. It feels like this one's a long time coming. I say that because I've been familiar with your content for a long time, although we hadn't actually sort of connected until recently. But this morning I did a workout at Gold's gym, and I just felt really excited to sit down with you. And I was kind of asking myself, where is that excitement coming from? And I think the root of it is that if you think about the nutrition sort of landscape today, to me, it feels like there's little walls between diet tribes. And, I can put my hand up. I think we've all probably contributed at some stage to the erection of those walls. But I think it's really healthy to be able to sit down with people that have different philosophies and different diets and be able to chat in a sort of healthy manner and stress test some of our ideas and be open to hearing different perspectives. So all that to say, I think you do a great job with all of the content that you put out, and really excited to see what we cover today.
No, it's going to be fun, man. It's always fun to take a look, reach across the aisle, and it's funny when I look at people that I've, over the course of the last decade have on the surface disagreed with. Commonly you find that you disagree on about 5 to 10% of things, but the lion's share, which is the big picture that people should be focused on, tend to agree on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's those polarizing aspects that I guess are more propagated by the algorithm, and create a bit more engagement and act as better headlines as well. So you're right. I think we can sometimes become a bit distracted, and ultimately what ends up happening is people just get very confused. Where do I start? What are the most important things for my health that I can do. So I think it would be good if we can clear up some of those distractions. I thought actually though, a nice fun way to maybe start this was, I want to throw some assumptions at you, and we can maybe have a bit of a laugh at these. Don't take any of these personally. The first one, and I always like to know this, I feel like it tells me a lot about the person I'm speaking with. I'm going to say that you are an animal lover in general, but I think you're a dog person more than a cat person.
That's a fair assumption.
Okay. Me too. I think cats are beautiful, but yeah, dogs are very special. I've been to Santa Barbara. I know you've spent a bit of time there. I'm going to assume that you've never eaten at a place called Oliver's in Montecito.
I know of Oliver's, but I've never eaten there.
Okay. I thought so. It's a plant-based restaurant. I've been there once. It was great. Grocery-wise, I am going to assume that you shop at Whole Foods and you tend to buy organic, but you're not attached to it.
Pretty accurate. I do tend to buy organic, but I'm not attached to it. But the lion's share of my shopping comes from Trader Joe's usually. Whole Foods, I don't have any problem with Whole Foods, but really comes down to a little bit more convenience, and I'm a creature of habit, and Trader Joe's has my simple essentials that I tend to have, and it makes it easy. But yeah, Whole Foods kind of irritates me a little bit. It's a weird vibe.
Training wise, and we just spoke a little bit off air about what you're doing. I'm going to assume that you like to do your cardio workout earlier in the day in a fasted state. And if you had complete control, and your preference would be to do resistance training later in the day after you've eaten something.
If I had all the time in the world, yes. But unfortunately I don't. I've got 2 small kids, and I'm very, very focused on spending time with them. So for me, I like to get my workout done as much as I can before they even wake up. So that means resistance training early in the day, which by default just ends up being fasted, even though I'm not married to resistance training fasted. It's just a convenience thing for early in the morning.
How many days a week are you doing resistance training?
I'd say 4 to 5. Yeah. So there's a number of days where I have resistance training on top of cardio days, where I'm a runner more than anything as far as cardio is concerned. So I will almost invariably run in the morning. Running in the afternoon, I feel doggone sluggish, man. It doesn't work for me. I mean, I'll get it done. But the actually funny thing is a lot of times my times are faster in the afternoon, but I just don't feel good. I just don't feel right. So, Anyway.
I think you might have the biggest biceps of any runner that I've seen. So we might circle back to resistance training and get some insights with regards to the way you structure that.
Oh, they're an encumbrance to my running.
I think that at one stage you were very heavily into, I guess, quote unquote, biohacking. But today, I'm not sure if you would consider yourself a biohacker.
I don't hope I don't offend people when I say this, but I have a little bit of I'm a little bit repulsed by that term nowadays. I think I called myself that back in the day because I just didn't know what I was. I thought biohacking was something completely different. I thought biohacking was much more just kind of hacking the human body as far as even nutrition's concerned, timing. But now I come to find out that's just life. And it's not really biohacking, whereas biohacking today has a connotation of manipulating pharmaceuticals and things like which if that's someone's problem, but I feel like, no, I definitely don't consider myself a biohacker, but that's a good, accurate assumption.
Okay, next, I'm going to assume that you must do some type of cold plunging, perhaps cold plunging in sauna at least 2 or 3 times a week.
Dude, I love that we're doing assumptions because we're breaking down some stereotypes. This is cool because it's interesting because I'm going to preface this a little bit.
By the way, we can reverse this at any stage.
Oh no, it's all good.
Like want to throw some back.
I had Peter Attia in my office a couple of days ago, and we were talking specifically about cold plunge, and I kind of joked about it, how I was like, it's a little trendy right now, and he's like, is it the thing? And I was like, oh dude, look on Instagram, like everyone's cold plunging. He's like, oh, I just don't know, I don't spend that much time on Instagram. So we talked about this a tiny bit. I own a cold plunge? Yes. I own multiple saunas. Do I cold plunge frequently? No. I feel like I get enough reactive oxygen species. I get enough oxidative stress from my life and my workouts where I don't need to add an additional hormetic stressor. Plus, I'm a very data-driven person when it comes to those kinds of things, especially how I spend my time. What I put in my body, yes, but how I spend my time, that's my most precious commodity. So if I'm going to, I can look at what I put in my body and look at data and see how split it is or whatever and make a decision. But when it comes down to my time, I really do look at that a lot. And there's just no compelling data for me to say that like cold plunge is going to extend my life. Cold plunge is going to make me perform better. Cold plunge is going to make me grow bigger muscles. It's going to make me recover better. However, the data is kind of there with sauna. The longevity data with sauna is pretty strong compared to cold plunge, where it just kind of doesn't exist. And Peter Attia and I were talking about this specifically when he went over to Sweden and was looking at this when he was filming the Limitless stuff. And he said the same thing. He said, like, yeah, we see data with sauna, but cold plunge, however, I do like how it makes me feel. I do like jumping in freezing cold water. It makes me feel like alive. I definitely get an adrenaline rush of some kind, but I also get a serious adrenaline dump like 2 hours later where I feel like I need to take a nap. I'm lean, so maybe really cold water affects me more.
Have you looked at any of the research? And I know it's very preliminary, looking at cold plunging and brown fat metabolism.
Yeah, it's kind of wild. I mean, you're not in there long enough to really elicit a powerful brown fat, activation or beiging of white fat to brown fat. Where the potential evidence lies, and you've probably seen this, is during the warm-up period afterwards. You get out and you let yourself go through that period of being really cold.
Finish in the cold.
Yeah. Right. So that seems to be where it's strong. However, I don't know. Like you see people will say you should go into a sauna and then go into a cold plunge. Like that's supposed to be the quote unquote order for that reason, because you get out of the cold plunge and you're supposed to have this warming up period where you have this, it's not so much the activation, it's the beiging, right? With brown fat, we have the two sides of the equation. We have the activation, which is the activation of what's already existing in your body, or you have the browning or the beiging where you're converting fat, white fat into brown fat. When you are lean and you are healthy, you don't need to convert a lot. You need to activate more. So you're not like, you're healthy, I'm healthy, we both work out a lot. We're going to be like pissing up a rope to try to like squeeze a little bit more brown fat conversion, if that makes sense. We're better off being like, how do we activate what we've got? Which, in my opinion, it's better to just turn the thermostat down to 65 degrees and just sit in a relatively cold room throughout the day. So I kind of got destroyed on Instagram one time when I said that I was in Tahoe. I have a place in Tahoe and it was really cold. It was like 12 degrees outside. And my cold plunge was frozen over and it was like really damn cold. And I hopped in the cold plunge and then immediately went into my sauna. And people just destroyed me. You're doing it wrong. That's the wrong order. And it was at that moment where I'm like, oh, I triggered something. All right, people are really tribal about this whole thing. So I was like, why? Like, tell me why. I'm like, oh, you're killing the brown fat, activation. I'm like, first of all, like, with all due respect, I don't want to sound like a conceited jerk or anything, but I'm like, at the time, 5-6% body fat. I was like, if I didn't hop in that sauna right afterwards, it would be utterly miserable. Like it takes me a long time to warm back up. And they're like, well, you're killing the brown fat activation by jumping in the sauna right afterwards. So, well, on the contrary, up in Tahoe, about 12 people die per year from cold shock jumping into the cold water from the ambient temperature. And my point in saying that is like, if you're in really, really cold water and you go from hot to ice cold, if you have a heart condition, you put yourself at serious risk, right? Much more so than if you did the opposite.
Yeah, there's certainly some contraindications. I think a lot of the research, both on the ice and on sauna, admittedly, is observational. And there probably needs to be more clinical trial data on both modalities. I mean, if you think about sauna and the observational data, and we could perhaps apply this to nutrition as well, but people that have access to sauna and are doing sauna more regularly, they're probably also adopting a number of other healthy behaviors, right?
Yep. And depending on the area that they live in, their socioeconomic status.
Right. Exactly.
You can afford a sauna, you can probably afford to eat better food. Yeah. Yeah. However, it's kind of interesting. You know, everyone toots the heat shock protein horn all the time, which is interesting. And there's definitely something there. There absolutely is something there. But what I find interesting about a sauna and what I like about a sauna is the pure as day fact that it's an exercise mimetic. So it's not going to replace cardio for me, but if I feel like I need to get my heart rate up and get a good sweat on, it just feels damn good.
And it seems to help with blood pressure as well, which is obviously a huge risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Okay. I'm going to assume that when it comes to beverages, I don't think you drink much, if any, alcohol at all. I think maybe you might have a glass of wine occasionally. And then when it comes to coffee or tea, I think you're more of a coffee man.
So you're somewhat accurate on the alcohol side. I haven't had a drop since when I was overweight, so it's been over 12 years. So that was a big thing for me when I said, okay, this is time to like get my life back in order. Alcohol was one of the first 3 things that I cut out. You know, it was Jack in the Box that I cut out, and then it was alcohol, and it was just going out past 9 p.m. Those were like rules for me. And so dude, I mean, who knows? Like I did so many things at once. It was impossible to isolate the variable. But
what's Jack in the Box for any Australian listeners?
So Jack in the Box is like a bottom of the barrel fast food joint here in the States, and it was a lifelong indulgence of mine. That was to get these they're tacos, Jack in the Box tacos, but they're barely even a taco. Like they're so riddled with grease that the shell becomes translucent, and whatever product is inside, they call it beef, but it's not. I don't know what it is. It's who knows what the heck it is. You know, there's probably about 250 calories in one little taco, and you know, you buy them for 2 tacos for 99 cents. You know, that was a big thing.
Was it just the taste, or have you kind of examined that behavior retrospectively and thought about what was the driving force?
Oh, we could get into that for sure. I'm not sure if you saw my interview with Chris Williamson, but you know, I went deep into my OCD childhood, my mother's, you know, mental illness and a lot of that. And I think I had a number of coping mechanisms. So yes, the taste for sure, but there was, you know, the only way that I really got my mother's love as a child was if I was running, because she was a runner. And so I ran my first marathon when I was 11 years old, and ran my first 10K when I was 6. And it was not like I was pressured into it, but it was just like I had to do what mom was doing. And it was always a celebratory thing, like after long runs, to get Jack in the Box. And that stuck with me through high school. Like when I was running cross country, after cross country practice, I'd go get Jack in the Box tacos. And then when I was in my 20s and I was very overweight, it was just, you know, times 12. So a lot more Jack in the Box tacos without the running. So they did taste good, but there was also just a comfort there.
Yeah, I want to circle back to that when we talk about weight loss and weight regain, and maybe some of the different factors that could be affecting someone who's trying to lose weight or trying to reduce their hunger or desire for these very seductive foods in this food environment that we find ourselves in. Coffee?
I'm a tea guy, green tea.
Green tea?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm not opposed to coffee.
I was thinking coffee and maybe dunking some butter in that.
Yeah, see, this is the stereotypes, man. So funny. It's great. I mean, I definitely went through my bulletproof coffee type phase, but I've never, ever been a big butter guy. It was always MCT oil in it for me.
Interesting.
I just never could wrap I guess like even as like a low carb guy, I never could wrap my head around like the benefits of extremely long chain fats in the morning outside of satiety. And like, I just didn't like, for me, the benefits of quote unquote butter coffee or bulletproof coffee was the brain effect. And there's solid literature on MCTs in the brain. And it just didn't make sense. I was like, why would I F this up by like, you know, cryomicrons being occupied with, you know, a butter that I'm melting, which is completely different from eating butter at a room temperature form, because the way the cryomicrons get saturated. it just didn't never made sense to me. And I didn't blindly do it. So I didn't start doing a bulletproof coffee type modality until I was at least decently versed in biochem. So when I first started losing weight, it was just black coffee because that's just what I did anyway. But yeah, I went through a phase where, like, when I was very overweight, where I was drinking anywhere from like 6 to 10 fully leaded Monster energy drinks per day, which definitely was not good. But no, I'm a huge green tea guy, and I cut caffeine out after about 11, just because it definitely affects my sleep, even with tea.
So coffee, MCT, no more? Or are you still
No more. And if I do have coffee, I'll have decaf. It feels different. I mean, maybe it's the theanine in green tea. Maybe it's psychosomatic because I'm getting some antioxidants, but I'm just a big tea guy.
Do you like matcha?
Love matcha.
Yeah.
I mean, that's potent though. So.
Yeah. Hey friends, are you ready to take your fermented food game and gut health to the next level? Look no further than my digital guide, Plant-Based Ferments. Inside, you'll discover some of my favorite recipes, including my soy labneh and homemade kombucha. Visit theproof.com/ferments for more details. That's theproof.com/ferments. Okay, that's enough from me. Let's get back to the episode. Okay, let's unpack this. So I think you said 12 years ago is when you lost a lot of weight. So yeah, walk us through that. My understanding is there was a few things that happened in your life, sort of moments that made you pause and reflect on your own health. Can you shed some light on that?
Have you heard you've probably heard my Jack in the Box story then, right?
I've heard parts of it. I've also read, I think your dad was diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah, so my dad was diagnosed with cancer, actually towards the end, like kind of towards my transformation, but he was getting sick and hadn't been diagnosed yet when I was really overweight. So it was like he was just battling with his health, but didn't have the diagnosis yet. The biggest piece for me, and people always kind of chuckle at this, was remember those whole Jack in the Box things. Well, when I was in my early 20s, when I was overweight, I was in like commission only. I was in a commission only job, and then kind of got into the private equity world and the healthcare world, ancillary lab services.
When you say overweight, what are we talking?
I was about 295 pounds at my heaviest. Okay. Yeah, so almost hit 300. Never actually hit 300. So I was big dude, and I went from being a very skinny runner to blowing up. And I've talked about this before. It truly was what happens if you get in the mindset of trying to gain weight to bulk and then just letting it all go to crap. It's just like I just didn't really work out anymore. I just ate like that and became very sedentary and very high stress, like over a period of 2 or 3 years. So the weight gain just piled on really, really quick. So I don't want to discourage people when they think that, oh, Thomas was obese his whole life and he battled this and battled lifelong obesity and lost weight and turned his life around. No, it was very much so self-inflicted. I mean, I lived a terrible lifestyle, and perhaps, my younger fitness experience as a young kid and as a teenager, I'm sure it helped, made it easier for me, because I don't want to sound like a jerk when I say that it wasn't terribly difficult for me to lose weight. I just had to flip that switch in my head. So I just hate steering people wrong. I just want to be authentic with that. However, there were things that didn't work for me. I tried doing like the 6 meal a day type thing. It just didn't work because, I could say, oh, because insulin. No, I mean, I think 7 years ago, Thomas probably would have said that. But now I think I realize that the more opportunities I had to overeat, the more that I would. So for me, fasting worked well for me at that point in time, because it was just an on-off switch. It was just okay, to stay away from food. That's how my brain was wired. But anyway, Jack in the Box. So I'm, at that time, I would have meetings on the other side of town, and I would, during that time, go to Jack in the Box after meetings, because I was on another side of the city where I wouldn't really get recognized as much in my mind. Stupid. So I would go to Jack in the Box. So I rolled through Jack in the Box. I got my tacos, and I pulled into a space right outside the drive-thru, and I'm sitting there eating, and I'm just listening to music in my car. And then this green 4Runner drives by, and it's a friend of mine, but not a close friend, just an acquaintance. And
when you say you didn't want to be recognized,
I just didn't want to be seen. So even at close to 300 pounds, I did not want to be the fast food drive-thru guy.
Okay.
I just knew that it was bad. I knew that. I knew what I was doing. It was a completely shame, guilt, terrible spot where I was just really was depressed sitting in my car eating,
And were you in the public eye then, or you were more concerned about friends and family, colleagues?
Yeah, totally. And I've always been a people pleaser to my detriment. I mean, I'm getting better at it now through years of therapy and understanding that, I just need to be my true authentic self, but always a people pleaser. So cared a lot what people would think. And I had a level of body dysmorphia where I didn't really like think about how unhealthy I was. I was clinically diabetic at that time. I was, my fasting glucose was 144. So, I mean, it was definitely like I had calls to action, but I didn't care. And I've been with my wife since high school, so I was with her at this time. Anyway, so I'm eating my tacos, and this guy drives by, and it's a friend, but not a close friend. And he waves to me so nonchalantly, like, hey, like, Tom, what's up? Like, this is what he would expect me to do. And it was that moment when I'm like, wait a minute, like, what the hell? Like, this dude, he didn't throw his arms up going like, oh my God, Thomas is eating Jack in the Box. He's looking at me saying, yeah, that's what I would expect that guy to do. It was just that moment where I'm like, this is the lens that people see me in. And it just clicked, man. And like, I went to Jack in the Box like one more time after that. I mean, I've been since to get like an iced tea and stuff like that. Don't get me wrong. But like I went to Jack in the Box, got tacos like one more time after that. And it was like 2 weeks later. And it was just like, no, like this didn't even feel right. So that flipped a switch in my head. And we kind of joke that I was a little bit driven by shame. Like it was like the shame just kind of got me where I'm just like, damn, like that's what people see me as. And that ability to be quote unquote shamed into things has been a little bit of a recurring theme in my life, to where I think I'm a hopelessly humble person sometimes, to where like I really do try to like, if people give me constructive criticism, I do want to take it. I don't want to just be a jerk. And like that was like, that in a weird way was like this criticism where I'm like, this is how he sees me. Like, this is not what I want to see myself as. I didn't immediately say I want to get ripped. I'm just like, no, I can't be the Jack in the Box guy. I got to get my diabetes under control. I got to get this has got to change.
There's some similarities there with, I mean, would you describe it as an addiction? Have you ever been asked that before?
Oh yeah. Cause I was also at the time very much so addicted to benzodiazepines. So
Right.
I was popping Xanax like mad. So, I mean, It was like, I think addictions are a recurring theme in my life as well.
Yeah. But I'm thinking that kind of shame that you were feeling is probably not too dissimilar to someone who has a porn addiction or who has a gambling addiction, and is kind of hoping that other people around them don't see that.
Yes.
Keeping it to themselves, but still feeling and experiencing that shame. So there's that tension between the indulgence and the shame.
Yeah.
So for you, it seems like the shame sort of won out to some degree.
Yeah, it was a constant tug of war, but it won at that point. Mm-hmm.
Right. So how does that play out? What are the steps that you took? The steps towards changing certain behaviors in your life so that you didn't end up back at Jack in the Box?
Yeah. I mean, so the first one was drawing that clear line in the sand with fast food. Like that was just a very big thing. It was a recurring theme in my life with the fast food. So I just cut that out. That was like step one, right?
Is that something that you just told yourself, or you had to communicate to your partner, friends, and like you had to have some accountability?
It was self-talk. I mean, I knew that was terrible behavior. There was no like, again, I wasn't fooling anybody. I wasn't even fooling myself. I knew every time I'd go through a drive-through, that's not good behavior. Like, it doesn't matter whether you're vegan, keto, paleo, whatever. Like, I think most people agree that fast food is not good. And it was, pretty obvious. So that was the first real step for me. I did try, Tupperwaring my food and things like that, like a bodybuilder. And that just didn't work for me. It was just too time intensive. So at the time, just given the world that I was in, there was a few people that I worked with that had some success with intermittent fasting. And they told me, hey, this might really work well for your kind of mentality. You're a really on-off, like hard charging guy. And yeah, I did try it. And at the time I was doing much more of like a daily intermittent fasting thing where I just was basically skipping breakfast, but it worked so well for me over that first 6 months, because I lost like 50 pounds in that first 4 or 5 months. It was pretty impressive.
And that was the main change that you made? That
was at that time. And that was the first stage, it was just eliminating breakfast. So, I mean, flash forward to, how I did things back in like maybe 2016, 17. Yes. Was I a little overzealous on promoting fasting? Yeah, I probably was. But man, it was the only friggin' thing that worked for me at the time. Like, it was just like, this changed my life really quick, and it was very, very fast. And then after that, I kind of got a little bit more nuanced with how I wanted to fast. I was like, I again was smart enough to realize that if I'm doing this every day, my body's going to adjust to it. So without really having keen biochemistry knowledge in that world, granted, what I was doing for work, I was in biomedical sales. So I understood how to articulate biochemistry mainly to physicians. and had a lot of like formal training in that world, although I don't have a degree in that field. So I understood how to explain it. And I think that's why I do an okay job at what I do now, is because I know how to sell the idea of it. I'm good at that. So with that, there were people that I respected in that community, and some were physicians, some were not. And they're the ones that kind of turned me onto it, and where I realized, well, okay, if this is caloric restriction via this phase, like my body's going to adaptive thermogenesis, I'm going to adapt. So then I kind of restricted and started fasting like 4 days a week with longer periods. And then I developed, an interest in the ketogenic diet, because I understood sort of that common denominator of fasting, ketones, ketogenic diet, and ketones, and kind of how that worked. And I became very, very interested in that. And then the rest of the weight came off over the next year and a half. And it just felt like a lifestyle that I could maintain.
You mentioned before insulin. How do you kind of think about obesity and overweight today, and the incidence of it? What do you think is driving it at the core?
At the risk of sounding very, I don't even know what the word would be. I think it's a serious mental illness that we're dealing with. And when I say mental illness, I don't want to say there's something wrong with people, they're sick, but I think we're dealing with a serious mental epidemic, whether it be massive coping mechanisms, whether it be, a combination of that with hyperpalatability. But I think we need to be looking there more than anything now. I think that we talked about this a little bit offline. I think there's, do we need more weight loss trials? Do we need more of these? Or do we need to start looking at what's making people tick and what's making people eat?
Yeah. Do you would have seen Diet Fits, and it's a study out of Stanford, but there's a bunch of different like meta-analyses comparing different diets. And obviously there's the sort of two opposing models, I guess, the energy balance model and the carbohydrate insulin model, that different research groups have kind of put together as ways of explaining, what is causing an increase in energy intake and weight gain. And what I find really interesting is that when you, and I'm sort of adding on to what you just said then about not needing any more weight loss trials, is that when you look at these trials that are comparing like a low carb diet with a low fat diet, I think in the short term, there does seem to be some benefit from low carb. Like in the first 6 months, there's a little bit of a benefit there. But then when you get to 12 months or 2 years, on the aggregate, the weight loss is very similar. And we see adherence seems to be a problem. But Diet Fits did this beautiful waterfall plot. And for each group, the low carb group and the low fat group, they plotted how individuals actually did. So on the aggregate, the weight loss in both groups was at 12 months was about the same. But within each group, some people in low carb did really well, some people not so well. In low fat, same thing. Some people responded really well, some not so well. And they were in that study trying to look, they looked at a few different predictors. So they were measuring insulin resistance and I think 3 different genes that are associated with obesity to see, can we sort of predict who would go better on a low carb versus low fat based on insulin resistance or a certain gene? And they couldn't. So there were the genes that they looked at anyway, and I'm sure there's probably more than 3, and insulin resistance didn't predict who was successful. And so I'm kind of left thinking about this data, and I have a few questions, and I'll kind of just throw this out there and get your thoughts. But the people that were successful, say on low carb, I wonder if they are just people that have certain behaviors and they would have also been successful on low fat, and vice versa, the people that did poorly on low carb because of certain emotional or behavioral, social elements, or perhaps genes that they weren't looking at, would have done poorly on both. I guess a couple of questions here that I have. One is, do we need to just all accept that an individual may do better on a particular macronutrient ratio? Some may do better on high carb, some may do better on low carb. And secondly, what do you think may help explain?
Yeah, I have some theories. For example, I tend to thrive very well on a low carbohydrate diet, with a caveat that I really thrived well on a relatively low carb diet when my fats were also low, independent of calories. So I would have, I shouldn't say independent, but even if my calories were, eucaloric between. That's anecdotal, but I do respond very well to low fat. But from a lifestyle perspective, I adhere better to low carb. So it's quite interesting, a little bit of a conundrum there. Now, I do feel that personally, as a long distance runner growing up, with lots of running under my belt, by the time I was 13, I'd run multiple marathons and well over 20 half marathons. So I can't help but wonder if epigenetically I conditioned my body to be very, very good at oxidizing fats. And that is a purely theory, but I've ran it through multiple people that are respected, and they say, that's a very valid theory, especially like at a young age when epigenetically you can make a lot of changes. Am I an outlier where I just really thrived with it? And it would explain multiple things. It would explain why when carbohydrates were reduced, I would lose weight, and it would explain why when fats would reduce dietarily, it would kind of shift to my body oxidizing my onboard fats a little bit easier because it just knows how to use them better. And I've talked about this in content, and sometimes it discourages people because they're like, oh, well, shoot, you're just an outlier. Well, no, it doesn't mean that it's not going to work for you. And it doesn't mean for sure that I'm an outlier. It's just a theory. But I do think that you're correct. I think that being able to adhere is probably the most important thing. And I think that when we look at the interesting data that we're seeing now on the region of the brain that fats tend to light up and activate, we're talking more, a little more hippocampal. We're talking a little more things that are associated with sensation. And then with sugar, carbohydrates, you're a different region of the brain that's a little more associated with taste and a little more dopamine hit. So does our history dictate what is more appealing to us and or addictive, right? So it's like we have our history, like how our brain is really operating. We have pure just fundamentals of just how we're wired that we can't change perhaps. That makes it where maybe you are going to get addicted to fats easier and I'm going to get addicted to carbs easier. That's data we just don't know. And rather than maybe focusing on just constant weight loss trials, maybe we should be focusing on how our brains are impacted by various macronutrients. But again, it's difficult. You can't just take a large cohort of people and like, how do you divide those cohorts up to really get to the bottom of it?
Yeah. And when I think of the two models, there was a paper written recently on the energy balance model and the carbohydrate insulin model. And this goes back to what you said at the start around often you can focus on the disagreement, but there's actually some agreement, irrespective of the kind of direction of causality. So carbohydrate insulin model sort of suggests that fat storage occurs first, and then that drives increased energy intake. Energy balance is that increased energy intake drives fat storage. Irrespective of the models, both sets of researchers point to these high glycemic, ultra-processed foods as being the primary problem with the diets.
And you combine that and you've got two regions of the brain that are getting activated, right? I can't help but look from an evolutionary perspective. Like if you had, how many foods in nature have high amounts of carbohydrate and fat together? Just not a lot of them. I mean, you can find them, but they're not like insanely high amounts. So you're not going to there's not a whole lot of ultra fatty fruits. There's not a whole lot of, it's just a very difficult situation. So are we designed to be taking in high concentrated, not moderate amounts, but high concentrated amounts of carbohydrates and fat at the same time? Like, is that sort of is our operating system not really welcoming of that?
That's a great point. That's often lost, is that you can think of these ultra processed foods as purely high carb, but they're very often a high carb and high fat.
Oh, almost always. Yeah.
That gets me thinking, did you see Kevin Hall's study where he looked at an unprocessed diet versus an ultra processed diet?
Yes. I haven't dove into the details of it, but I've seen.
Okay. Well, he did this neat study, and it was in a metabolic ward, so it's like quite highly controlled, crossover design. And he matched the macronutrients, and so fat's the same, carbs is the same, protein's the same, fiber's the same, sodium's the same, matched all of that, but one diet was an unprocessed diet and the other is ultra processed. And on average, when people are eating that ultra processed diet, despite leveling the playing field, because that doesn't really happen in real life, these ultra processed foods are much lower in protein, usually lower in fiber. They have a lot of properties that could lead to overconsumption. But despite matching all of those in that arm of the study, people ate almost 500 calories more per day, right? And I was thinking the other day, it would be really interesting to redo that study and have a third arm. I would love to know if you had an ultra processed food group, but all of that ultra processed food was keto. So you obviously you're not going to be matching there for carbohydrate content, but you would try and match for fiber and palatability, try and make these just as palatable, but we're taking out those carbohydrates. Do people still overconsume the 500 calories per day? What do you think? Do you think that people would still consume an excess of calories if all of the ultra processed foods in our food environment were keto?
Artificial sweeteners, yes or no?
Yeah.
Okay.
So palatability is the same.
Okay.
So imagine that we sat down with all of the big food manufacturers and we said, guys, we understand what you can do to change your food products in a way that we think will reduce obesity, but you can still make them taste just as delicious. You just have to reduce the carbohydrates in there, make them keto. You can have more fat, and we can use artificial sweeteners to make sure they taste good.
No, I think people would gain just the same amount of weight, if not even more. I mean, there's still hyperpalatable garbage on keto. I mean, that's what you stated by sitting down with the food manufacturers. That kind of happened. I mean, it's just, look at all of them, man. I mean, they've all bought up keto brands. I don't want to name out a bunch of names, but you look at High Key, you look at all these, like they're getting purchased by Kraft Heinz. They're getting purchased. This has happened. They're like, okay, we'll test the waters with it. Let's see. Because they don't particularly care about obesity. They just care about what they're moving. So if they say, okay, well, cool, we can check a box of doing something good too. But we have to remember that at the end of the day, man, and I know I'm the black sheep of the keto community when I say this, but I mean, fat stores easier as fat than carbohydrates do. And we have to accept that. I mean, carbs have 7 different steps plus just to convert for de novo lipogenesis. That's not bullshit. That's very real. And in a surplus, fat will store easier than carbohydrates will because there's just less energy involved in storing those fats. And some will say, well, we're an open thermodynamic system. We're not a closed thermodynamic system, so that doesn't matter. No, I think it still matters. I think it's still the fact that fats will assimilate and synthesize. Fatty acid synthase is going to make that job a one-step job. So if you take something that is hyperpalatable, that is sweet, even whether it's with erythritol or sucralose or whatever, but it's calorically dense, I would argue that they're probably going to eat more of it. But then will they gain a lot of fat? I think if you look at a simple calorie model, they will. But perhaps there's other pieces there that we don't know. I mean, there's pieces of metabolic dysfunction that we don't know. Like if you take someone that's this is purely theoretical, but they've got, let's say 75% of their mitochondria are operating at normal capacity and 25% are dysfunctional. If putting them in that state allows the mitochondria to regain access to fuel via a backdoor mechanism, i.e. ketones, then maybe going to restore the health of those mitochondria. And those mitochondria are going to function, their energy manufacturing is better, and then maybe they do lose weight. But that does not deny the fact that the calories still came into equation because now their resting energy expenditure just increased. So calories still matter. You get what I'm saying? Right. Yeah. So I think to say that the calories don't matter is a little bit just disingenuous. I feel like they always matter, whether we're an open thermodynamic system, a closed thermodynamic system, whether carb insulin model matters or not. Why are we still throwing calories in, calories out under the bus? It's still important.
Yeah. Well, I think the carbohydrate insulin model still respects the first law of thermodynamics.
It does in the scientific community, not on Instagram.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the actual model put forward by the researchers, I think that model respects the first law of thermodynamics. It's just that direction of causality is different. It's that these high glycemic, carbohydrate-rich foods are increasing insulin levels. We get increased fat storage, and then the increased fat storage drives increased energy, or drives hunger and increased energy intake. But ultimately, that model is still explaining obesity through an excess of calorie consumption.
Yeah, exactly, which people don't realize. And well, with that, I mean, I want to kind of flip and ask you something. I mean, as far as high levels of insulin, high glycemic spikes, things like that, if you are looking at your time in range for glucose, this is bona fide curiosity. Like, do you think having a high spike but coming down in an appropriate time is perfectly acceptable, or more acceptable than mildly being chronically out of range? For example,
great question.
Yeah, I think about it a lot because I wear a CGM, and I don't always, but
I think time in range is probably the most important. I noticed that you wear a CGM. I'm not sure if you listened to any of my conversations with Drew Harrisberg on my show. He has type 1 diabetes, wears a CGM, and we talk about CGMs a lot. Maybe you can convince me of the use of CGMs in people without diabetes. Yeah. So I've been, I don't want to say critic. I guess just speaking candidly here, I felt companies have maybe put the cart before the horse in terms of, do we fully understand at a population level, if you give CGMs to people without diabetes, does it lead to better food choices? Does it lead to an improvement in diet quality? Does it lead to an overall improvement in biomarkers? Not just one biomarker, but blood lipids, blood pressure, whatever it is, a sort of suite of things that we know are established with disease. And I haven't seen any studies that have really been able to demonstrate that.
No. Well, let me ask you a question. Like, why do you think I'm wearing a CGM? Another stereotype or assumption here.
I don't know. You're a biohacker.
Fuck you.
No. We've clarified that. That was a cheap shot. Why are you wearing a CGM? Are you in ketosis now?
No.
You're not in ketosis. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Based on the data that I've read, I'm honestly not sure.
Yeah.
You can maybe explain to me what benefits you derive from it.
So I don't wear one all the time. Fun fact, I'm wearing one right now because I was filming a couple of videos specifically testing specific foods.
I saw someone thought you photoshopped.
Oh my gosh, that was hilarious. Yeah, there's a number of people, dozens of people. I was just like, this is insane. Yeah, no, because it's dark, and then the background was dark. It looked like my tricep was like demented, and people were like, dude, you photoshopped your tricep. No, like, look closer.
I've seen the tricep in real life, guys. They're real.
So I don't wear one all the time. I wear one, maybe a couple of months out of the year. And for me, it's I cross-reference data, like between my Whoop and my Aura, and I'm always looking for commonality and looking at things. I mainly become interested in how I respond differently to things when I'm sleep deprived or when I'm under stress. So I am less looking at how a food is treating me or how I'm responding to a food, and I'm more interested in variance in my stress. If I get into an argument with my wife, what happens? And that's what's wild. That's what's fascinating to me. And it's a little bit just things that I already know, like, yeah, okay, I know there's going to be a catecholamine effect here where I'm going to probably have an increase in my glucose. But to see what happens and see, like, okay, when I'm in a stressed state and I eat, I do spike more and I don't come down as easy. So for me, it's understanding those things and then cross-referencing that data with my strain and think, I don't expect people to do that. So why I wear one is simply because I'm just a hopeless, curious person when it comes to that. Like, I'm not going to find the answers, but I'm curious, and I like to kind of test and be my own N of one on things. So to say that I wear one to say like, how am I going to respond to a banana? I mean, I've eaten just about every kind of food I can eat, and I've seen it under CGM, and I know typically how I respond to it. I do think that people that are interested and motivated in such a way could get benefit out of it. But more so, I think it teaches people in a way that is opposite of what people in my typical metabolic optimization sphere would think. I try to teach people that, just like we talked about, that time and range, if you eat that higher glycemic rice cake, for instance, if you spike high, who gives a shit as long as you come back down? So as long as you come back down and your insulin is doing its job, I think that's where there's the demonization of insulin that happens too. It's like, no, this is a very important hormone, like probably one of the most important peptide hormones. Why are we talking shit on it? It doesn't make sense. So like if you eat that rice cake and you spike high but you come down fast, your body did what it's supposed to do. You should not judge a food based on how it spiked you. You should judge a food based on how you respond by not coming down. And that tells you more about you than it does the food. So we have this problem where I think it could cause people to really like look at food strange. Like, I can't eat that because it affects me.
That's where I think the studies that look at diet quality, but then test different instructions, because what I'm hearing is you're sort of suggesting that the utility of it depends on the instructions that you're giving that person. How are they interpreting that data? And I guess one of my concerns is that if you take the approach of flatter the better, then, I mean, I could think of all sorts of dietary swaps where you could potentially swap out a food that we know is consistent with good cardiometabolic health in place of a food that's not, just to get a sort of flatter blood glucose. But I mean, at the same time, we have no window into what's that doing to lipids and a whole bunch of other things at the same time.
It would be cool if we could, people would do lipid tolerance tests as well. That's a real thing that is underrated.
Yeah, I'd love to have the continuous blood glucose monitors also measuring blood lipids continuously.
Dude, it's so important because, I mean, just a simple fact, it's like if I eat some almonds and then I eat some like honey roasted almonds, it's like you could say, okay, well, you attenuated that spike, but what's happening to lipids at that time? Better yet, let's say something that's not a mono or a polyunsaturated fat, let's say something like a saturated fat, which has potential ramifications as far as insulin resistance is concerned. If I ate a stick of butter along with some sugar, you're telling me that, well, you attenuated that spike. So good job.
Let's double click on that, because I think that's might be news to some people, particularly coming from someone who is in the low carb community. So what are you saying about saturated fat with respect to insulin resistance?
Yeah, I mean, well, there's a number of different demonstrated pathways in which it seems to affect insulin resistance, whether it comes down to, toll-like receptor 4, TLR4, which essentially affects how we create insulin receptors, how we express insulin receptors. It doesn't mean you eat saturated fat and you automatically have an immune response. It means that, once again, when you're in a state of overnutrition, I think that's the operative word, when you're in a state of overnutrition, the saturated fat lever seems to be a bigger lever to pull as far as a negative effect. So if you and I were both at 1 calorie above our maintenance, we were both in surplus, and you ate a bunch of monounsaturated fats and I ate a bunch of saturated fat, arguably the research suggests that I am going to reduce my insulin sensitivity more than you. I mean, that's fairly strong data. And, there's a number of mechanistic trials and a number of data and number of rodent model studies, but there's still a handful of even, human trials that have suggested that as well, where you look at, the triglyceride level as associated with saturated fats and how that impacts mainly the expression of insulin receptors. That's a very real thing. And I think that the low carb community should take a lesson from that, because unfortunately we have this, such a dogmatic view that we're not willing to look at that.
Yeah, I've always found that interesting. I mean, my I guess approach to macronutrients is, I think at the end of the day, choose the ratio that if you're trying to lose weight, choose whatever ratio it is that feels easiest for you to be in a calorie deficit. And if that's low carb, amazing. if that's helping you lose weight. If that's high carb, amazing. But I think no matter which direction you go, that then there should be a conversation around quality. So quality of the fat, what type of fat is it? And same on the carb side, what type of carbohydrates are you eating? Because we know that fat and carbohydrates are just umbrella terms. And on that saturated fat piece, I had Richard Johnson on my show. I'm not sure if you've come across his work. He's done a bunch of stuff on fructose, looking at refined sugars and liver fat. Yeah. And also I spoke to Alan Flanagan about this. And that's really, really interesting data, because we know alcohol, we know refined sugars in a hypercaloric diet particularly drive an increase in hepatic fat, which creates insulin resistance in the liver. And essentially when you become insulin resistant in the liver, it's sort of like the tap on the bath that you can't turn off the spout, and you just have excess blood glucose or glucose going into the blood, and blood sugar levels go up. But there's a bunch of research also looking at how different types of fat affect hepatic fat, and different trials. And, some of these are not the longest term trials, so they probably need to be further explored. But it is interesting to me that when I look at that, in the trials comparing, say, saturated fats to polyunsaturated fats, you do see on a sort of calorie equivalent basis in both diets, you see an increase in hepatic fat in the saturated fat group.
Yeah, it's actually, not sure if we're talking about the same study here, but it was like a 55% increase or something like that.
Yeah, so it's kind of I've always found it interesting when you jump on Twitter and there seems to be, within the low carb community, a lot of people that are just adamant on defending saturated fat at all costs. And I kind of just think, I just wonder where that comes from. Why do you think people are sort of not receptive to the idea that, hey, they can stay low carb, stay keto, but maybe swap some of the sort of foods in their diet to change that fat profile?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of just like an anti-establishment type mindset. I think it's just, okay, we're keto, the whole world's against us. Like, oh, you like your, your plant-based oils. Well, screw you. We're going to eat butter. I think a lot of it's out of spite. I don't think I've converted a lot of those people. Let's put it that way. If you get the right people that are open-minded, have a large platform of a lot of low carbers, not as much now, but I lost a lot of them when I opened my eyes and said, I can't ignore this. Like, I can't ignore the fact, like, with a platform my size, I can't be just saying, go eat a bunch of saturated fat, like, not in good faith, like, knowing that it's just incorrect data to say that. So I typically suggest people say, hey, a nice ground rule for you is 20% of your fat calories should be saturated fat. Or I shouldn't say should, I don't like that word, but that's a good number. Stick around there, try to get the rest. I also say, hey, like, from a calorie standpoint, it actually works quite well. If someone is eating meat and you have, let's say you have 2 ribeye steaks and they're the same weight, the chances of those 2 ribeye steaks having equal calories is hugely slim, because the marbling of fat, everything's going to be different. One ribeye steak might have 20 grams of fat, one might have 30, but on the surface they look very similar. So when you're actually trying to control things a little bit, and I understand not everyone's trying to do that, but it makes it a lot harder to gauge your calories that way. So I typically say, hey, you know what? This is a fine thing for you. Like, if you're eating meat, and I understand a lot of your audience, maybe vegan, vegetarian, but I'm sure you have a lot that aren't as well. It actually works great, because then you're like, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to control my saturated fat. Maybe I'll eat leaner meats. Maybe I'll eat leaner protein sources, and I'll add my fats in where I can control them a little bit more and understand what I'm getting. I'm not saying everyone needs to be orthorexic and obsessive about this, but it was a pretty subtle shift for me to say, hey, you know what? No, I'm going to not eat fattier cuts of meat. I'm going to reduce the butter. I'm going to lean into my macadamia nuts. I'm going to lean into my avocados. I'm going to lean into my nuts that I can eat. I get some digestive issues from a lot of nuts, but yeah.
Yeah, I admire the awareness of responsibility that you just mentioned. I often think about that in terms of, and I'm speaking to a slightly different community. As you said, I think a lot of people that listen to this show they're plant focused. It could be Mediterranean style diets, or it could be vegetarian, it could be vegan. but I kind of feel responsible to try and pull people back towards the evidence when things get a bit crazy with claims. And I have noticed that you seem to be trying very hard to do the same at your end. What was it with regards to saturated fat over the years? Like, how did your views evolve? Why did they evolve? This episode is proudly brought to you by Inside Tracker. Track your blood biomarkers, understand your biological age, and receive personalized lifestyle tips backed by evidence to optimize your health. To get started with Inside Tracker today and get 20% off your first purchase, head to insidetracker.com/Simon. That's insidetracker.com/Simon for 20% off.
I broke out of what I called the echo chamber a few years ago, and my eyes just opened to a lot of things. I was pretty hardly opposed to high amounts of fructose before. I still don't think high amounts of fructose are good. Obviously, I don't think high amounts of anything are good. But I took pretty firm stances. But I did
from fruit or like
no, just in general. High fructose in general. But it's quite hard to get a ridiculous amount of fructose from fruit if you're paying attention, right? And even if you're not paying attention.
What if you're a fruitarian?
I guess it's right. As long as they're moving, right? That's the hard part. Is like when you take energy abundance, that's when it's a problem. That doesn't mean that they're eating pure fructose. I think people think all fruit is all fructose. Like, no. Like, look at a kiwi. It's largely glucose, right? So that's a little bit of a moot point because, like, I think if someone's eating fruit, they're getting, depending, yes, you could choose a fruit that is purely high fructose. And what would happen if they ate only that, but if they're also in a deficit and you're phosphorylating AMPK, then there's no problem.
The Hadza, I think, consume a fair bit of fructose.
What's that?
The Hadza tribe.
Yeah. And
they stay pretty lean.
They do stay lean, and they're very active. Right. Yeah, so I think it's, we come right back down to this AMPK, activation and being able to, like, if you're in that proper deficit, however that is done, largely, especially through activity, higher carbohydrate-based diet than perhaps. But yeah, it's, I had to open my eyes, man. Part of it was like fiduciary responsibility too. I'm like, wait a minute, like, I've got this platform, like, eyes are on me, brands are on me, but also having my kids, like, I look at health different now. I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and there's a couple of things. Like, for one is, like, I don't want my kids to grow up and be like, oh, my dad was the one-sided guy that just, you know what I mean? Like, I just don't want that. I don't want that for myself. I don't want that for them. I really, truly, sincerely want them to, like, look at the internet and say, like, wow, no, my dad was pretty, like, even keeled and he was cool. And, like, that was a big driver for me. It really was. So, I wish I could say that it was like I saw some compelling piece of evidence, but it was more so like, wait a minute, no, I'm doing this the wrong way. Like, I need to look at the bigger picture. I've got the resources now. I've got the team. Like, it would be irresponsible for me not to.
Right. So do you keep an eye, of course you keep an eye on biomarkers related to insulin resistance, blood glucose control, that side of things. Do you keep an eye on blood lipids as well?
Yes, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, my cholesterol sits pretty low, around a total of 175. I do keep very close attention to that. VLDL is in very good shape. Granted, I eat largely a Mediterranean diet, even when I'm low carb. So
so for people that are interested, you mentioned before the sort of 80-20 or 20% of fats being saturated type of very general rule. But from a food perspective, so what does that look like for you in terms of where you're getting your fats from?
Yeah. So, my fats, I do eat, I don't eat a ton of meat, believe it or not. Yes, I'm not vegan, I'm not vegetarian, but a lot of my protein comes from cottage cheese, comes from yogurt, comes from eggs. I really do hover a lot of that.
Closet vegetarian over here.
Yeah. Hey, no, don't eat, seriously, man. Like, I've actually thought about being vegetarian because it's just like, I actually feel quite good. And this is like, I put myself into, like, red meat. I don't even feel that good eating. The only red meat I'll really eat is typically ground. Like, I don't feel good diving into a big fatty steak. I just don't feel that great.
Careful. You might lose some of your audience here.
That's fine. I think most of them by now know where I stand on that. I'm a red meat a couple times per week kind of guy. A big emphasis on fiber for me. It always has been. My fats are definitely a focus. I tend to periodize my diet where I go periods of higher fat, lower carb, not necessarily keto, and then moderately high carb, lower fat. I tend to kind of go back and forth with that. It seems to work really well for me from a body composition perspective. I don't really have an answer as to why, except because I try to keep food, calories about the same, but I find that like every time I make a pivot, like once a month or so, I get like a nice newbie gain out of it. So if something happens, I don't really, don't have an explanation. Yeah, it's like a newbie gain every time I switch to okay, I'm going to go back to higher carb, or for me, higher carb is more than like maybe 175 or so. It's not super high carb, but lower fat, higher carb. So the bulk of my diet, I eat a lot of like regular olives. I eat a lot of mushrooms. A lot of my my starchy carbs are still coming from like purple sweet potatoes. I eat a ton of sweet potatoes, probably more than I should, just eat a ton of them. Lots of asparagus, lots of Brussels sprouts. Those are really my staples as far as like the plant foods are concerned. Probably too many macadamia nuts. I'm a big fan of those. A lot of avocados. Big into my olive oil. I already said olives. Like anything kind of that monounsaturated.
Right.
So
we have much more in common than many people might believe. I mean, my diet is plant-based, but it's probably quite different. And I've spoken about this particularly on Twitter. It's more of a higher fat plant-based diet than many would be either recommending or following in the plant-based community.
Yeah. Where do you get most of your fats?
Similar. So avocado, olive oil. I love olive oil. Nuts and seeds. Tofu has a lot of fat in it as well. So those would probably make up, I guess, the majority of my fats on a daily basis. There's some nut butters and stuff in there. And yeah, I think my philosophy and approach on that, which is a little bit different to some in the plant-based community, is I think unsaturated fats are inherently beneficial. I don't think we need to fear fat and be trying to have a sort of low total fat diet. I think it could be helpful if someone is following a high carb diet and it is really focused on weight loss, particularly adding in olive oil. These very calorie dense foods can make weight loss a bit harder for some people. But I personally find I feel much better when I have a higher amount of total fat in my diet.
Yeah. How do you feel if you increase carbohydrate intake? Does it change you much? Or?
Yeah, it does. I feel like I'm probably a little more sluggish in the afternoon. So that's another reason energy levels for me are better and my diet's not low carb. I'd say it's like moderate carbohydrate.
What's that like? Maybe it's roughly the same number as me, maybe 100 to 200.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, probably 200 grams of carbohydrates, somewhere around that. And that leaves me feeling really, really good. But I do know, and I have friends who have slightly less fat and slightly more carbohydrates, and they feel great too. So I think you kind of need to play around with that. I guess the main point being that I just don't think people need to fear unsaturated fats. And I think like the whole dietary guidelines and sort of total fat recommendations, I think that's starting to go out the window. I think the recommendations to be aware of limiting, moderating saturated fat are good and necessary, but I'm not sure there needs to be a sort of total fat upper limit.
Yeah, no, I tend to agree. And do you consolidate a lot of your carbohydrates, if you do, towards the latter half of the day for that reason? Yeah, same here.
I'd say most of my carbohydrates are after my workout, in that meal after the workout, which tends to be actually my second meal of the day. And my dinner, and I've been playing around with this more recently, following some episodes that I did with Courtney Peterson, who's looking at time-restricted eating, and also meal timing, and Emily Manugian, who works out of Sachin Panda's lab. And I have found, and this is anecdotally, that a slightly smaller dinner or less calories before I'm going to bed, I'm sleeping better, and my recovery seems to be better. Is that something that we can generalize to everyone? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it depends on training, depends on a number of things. I saw something interesting. I can't remember where it was published. It was just relatively new, but it was like, regardless of calories, what they did determine was that plant-based or animal-based, if you took an active person, large meal or small meal at night what really seemed to dictate their sleep for an active person was if they made their protein requirements. So it was kind of interesting. So I feel like I agree with you because that's how I am too. And I usually do consolidate my carbohydrates towards the latter half of the day as I tend to sleep better, but they're not like a large bolus of food before bed. It's, I cut it out 3 hours before bed generally. I try to be done with eating by 6 and I just don't touch anything, or if I do, it's very light until then. But there's also times where like I can just tell that I just didn't get enough protein that day. So maybe, I'll have even a protein shake before bed or something like that, or maybe a little bit of Greek yogurt just to get that protein level up. And that's something where the circumstance in which having a little food before bed actually helps me sleep.
Yeah, that's the other sort of area that I would place quite a bit of focus on is the protein. I want to make sure I'm getting enough total fat, but I'm also prioritizing protein. Protein is harder to get on a plant-based diet in terms of hitting a certain amount if you're trying to optimize for hypertrophy without sort of blowing out your calories. So for me, I tend to lean more into tofu and tempeh and beans and less into whole grains and that sort of category of starches than some people, because I'm already getting enough fiber in the diet through all the vegetables and the legumes and whatnot. So that's the way that I kind of structure my own diet. You mentioned fiber before, and this is another one where I think it's a little bit baffling for me, given the data on fiber. It's pretty solid when you look at total mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, type 2 diabetes. There seems to be these dose-dependent benefits. More fiber in the diet, the better outcomes people tend to have, and that's very consistent across the world. It's been replicated a lot. But there is this kind of growing trend online where people would sort of have you believe that fiber, it's not an essential nutrient like a vitamin or mineral, so do we really need it? How do you feel about that?
I mean, I'm a big fiber guy, so I feel personally attacked. I've always been a big fiber. I shouldn't say always. I mean, I didn't pay a lot of attention to it when I was overweight, but as long as I've been focusing on my health, I've been a huge fiber guy. And I think that I've gone to a fair bit of war defending that hill. It's although I just, at this point, I don't try to fight with people that don't want to hear it. If they're not open to it, that's fine. But where I do try to convince people is it's really difficult to sell insurance, is what I always say. Right? Like, if I'm talking to someone in their 30s or 40s, it's very difficult to tell them, especially if they don't have kids and they don't look at it through that lens, like, about all-cause mortality and just death and fiber's association there. Feels a long way away where it's really difficult to, I'll worry about that when I'm 60. So perfectly good-hearted people that just, I just want to feel good today. I just want to feel good today. And fiber bloats me, so I don't want to eat it, or I'll worry about it later. So I try to look at, okay, what are short-term things where I can get people excited? And unfortunately, when you look at the short-term stuff, you do have to turn to more rodent model stuff. However, there are some human models that still demonstrate this, but things like, the benefit of a diverse microbiome, benefit of butyrate-producing bacteria and its ability to help fatty acid oxidation, help glucose uptake, help GLUT4 translocation, help GLUT4 expression. So I'm like, well, what does that mean, Thomas? It means in the short term, within a week of increasing your fiber intake, you're increasing your GLUT4 expression. It means potentially lower glucose, not just from eating fiber with that carbohydrate meal. Oh, sure, well, I eat fiber. It's gonna delay the absorption of those. Yes, that's true. But there's also a downstream longer term effect that's going to help you in the interim too. If I told you that by eating more fiber, you oxidize more fat, and there's very solid rodent model data, we're talking 3 to 4x more fatty acid oxidation and reduction of fatty acid synthase, less ability to store fat, more ability to oxidize it. It's pretty dang clear. I mean, I wouldn't say it's proven, but that's clear stuff where it's hey, guys, the more butyrate producing bacteria, the more acetate producing bacteria you have, the better cellular function. And usually when I explain things like that to people, they're like, all right, I'm sold on fiber.
That's called knowing your audience.
Yeah, totally.
And I mean, the other benefit, and more people are talking about this now, given the sort of rise of GLP-1 agonists is the short chain fatty acids increasing GLP-1 levels.
Totally. That's I literally just filmed some content this week on that. I was like foods that increase GLP-1 activation, which, I mean, you don't want to be cheeky with it and say that it's going to be more potent than semaglutide, but I mean, we're talking a pharmaceutical versus doing this holistically. And
it might be different for someone who is morbidly obese and needs to lose a lot of weight versus someone who's trying to maintain weight and prevent gaining.
Yeah. And I just find it fascinating. I mean, and, you know, especially like just the microbiome in general. And I suppose if you're a zero carber, you know, you're someone that's doing carnivore, you end up in a different category, which I'm not super fluent on that science, but I mean, I know it's once you're in that zero carb category, there's less need for fiber for motility, but you're also looking at a very narrow, much less diverse microbiome. I have an interesting theory. This is purely theory, but I'm curious your take on it because I think we're aligned on it, but it's interesting. As we started to get more, the ability to get foods and fruits and vegetables and fibers from all areas of the world, we tended to have an increase in like our IQ, like kind of hockey stick. If you look at, you know, basically Industrial Revolution and when we were able to start transporting things. So people in, you know, I could get a leek from Russia, you know, whatever, various different forms of fiber. Arguably, our microbiome would have diversified a lot, like the different types of fiber. And, you know, we see that replicated in data where it's like you're eating the same kinds of fiber, definitely beneficial for the gut. But when you start adding new fibers in, you know, inulins, beta glucans, this and that, it gets even bigger. Maybe you know, the growth of our just ability to be more intellectual people has come from that. And you start going back, like, do we potentially retreat back to being cavemen if we start like reducing fiber intake? All right. I mean, it sounds weird coming from like a guy that's, you know, eats meat, right? Like, I mean, I'm just, the point is that I think that fiber is important.
Do we become an ape again?
Yeah. Do we start to like, and you start, it's going to sound so bad. I mean, they're probably not listening to this, but I mean, people, like a lot of even the carnivore community, like they just become so angry and so just mean about it. And I can't help but wonder, I'm like, is it because you're retreating back to this? Like, you need
are we trying to trigger as many people as we can today?
Well, it's just, I get it. Like, I understand from an autoimmune perspective where carnivore has its application for certain people. I do. I totally do. I've done experiments with it. I felt like dog shit when I did it, but it was, you know, I do understand from an anti-inflammatory or just an autoimmune situation, you're just eliminating variables. Like you're just getting so narrow. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm just like cold-hearted towards people that are doing carnivore, because I just understand the pain. You know, my wife has autoimmune conditions. You know, she never did carnivore. She did, you know, autoimmune paleo, like AIP, and it worked very well for her. And ultimately finding that with her particular issues with autoimmune, Hashimoto and lupus and things like that, much more geared towards you know, gluten issues. So she still eats carbohydrates. She just eliminated gluten and her TPO antibodies came right back to normal, and she didn't have to take levothyroxine. So she understood like how important nutrition is and specific foods that can cause flares. When someone is really dealing with heavy autoimmune issues, and I just understand, I don't take this the wrong way as condoning it and saying that this is the way it should be done, but I understand how someone can end up there.
You can empathize.
Yeah, it's just like, okay, you narrow it down, you come down to one thing, you can isolate the variable.
That part there, which is the logical approach, what you just described, seems to sometimes be a little bit lost on people, because I can totally empathize. If you have some sort of inflammatory related condition and you have particular intolerances, there can be certain plant foods that could be aggravating symptoms. So eliminating the full suite of them, you feel better, but which of those foods that you eliminated was contributing to your symptoms? And I think stepping through that potentially with a dietitian or someone that can sort of hold your hand and help you if you need it, to then work out, how do I start to reintroduce foods that are not triggering my symptoms so that I can enjoy the benefits of fiber? Yeah.
Well, that's where we kind of run into a problem where like people like you have empathy towards that, but then you have people that are just saying like, well, no, you're causing the, like you can't just, you know, reintroduce a food, like food's not going to, or people that just make a blanket statement where these foods are never going to cause a problem. Like that's not correct. Like there absolutely can be people that have issues with cashews or have an issue with, particular vegetable. Like it can absolutely happen. And I think there needs to be recognition of that from both sides in order to ever actually help that person.
Yeah. And I think there's some, I guess, semi or quasi explanations for some of this. And maybe, if you look into the way that our lifestyles have changed and that living in the modern world compared to say the hard are, antibiotic overuse, potentially. Antibiotics have their place, but if we're over prescribing them, what's that doing to the microbiome? Vaginal versus C-section births, we've got breastfeeding. There are a number of different environmental factors that could be leading to disrupted or sort of dysbiosis in the gut that could then be setting people up to have these intolerances. You mentioned before it's hard to convince someone who's 30 or 40 to really care about total mortality and these sorts of things. And I think when I think about cardiovascular disease, that's one of the biggest pain points. Because if you look at atherosclerosis, and I just did a lipid series with Thomas DeLauer, I think many people who are 20, 30 are sort of under this impression that when they're 50, they can focus on that and try and avoid having a heart attack or stroke, but sort of are unaware that actually that heart attack that someone has when they're 50, or like my dad had a heart attack when he was 41, in front of me. And that heart attack is the result of decades of pathology brewing underneath the surface. You sort of mentioned one example there, but how do you think we can better get through to younger people to care about their long-term health?
Well, there's, I think on that, I think there's some short-term ways where you need to get them excited about it. You need to make it somewhat entertaining for them. You need to make it digestible. I don't think that we can inherently change. When you're 20, 30, as Chris Williamson would say, you're made of rubber and magic, and it's really difficult to really understand, because you're like, I can go and I can eat that Pop-Tart, or, I can eat that stick of margarine, or I can eat that stick of butter, and it doesn't change me tomorrow. It doesn't do anything. My blood work looks the same. Like when you're looking at that, it's very difficult, and it's not until people have a call to action. So I think you need to make it fun to live long. I think you need to make it about, it's not about how long you're going to live. It's about hey, Bob, what do you like to do for fun? I like to play football. Do you want to play football for a long time, or you want to not be able to play football? Hey, Mary, what do you like to do? Oh, well, I really like to rock climb. It just makes me happy. Well, that's cool. Don't you want to do that for a long time? Do you I think it needs to be roped into what they do for fun, and less about you need to eat this so that you don't die, because that's just not going to work for them. It needs to positive spin needs to put on this, especially for the younger generation, for the Gen Zers and for the people that are in their early 20s right now. It's they need entertainment, and they're smart people. These younger generations, they're not. You look at this and you think oh, these people just scroll Twitter and Instagram and they have no brain for themselves. No, they really, if you look at, they do investigate things. They do look at things. They just are on a slightly different operating system than maybe we are in our 30s, right? And it's, I think we just need to understand okay, well, how do we explain this to them on their level? Because for you and I, maybe we were always told by people that were 20, 30 years our senior, this is what you need to do. Maybe we're not open to listening to that until we are wait a minute. Oh, wait, this is going to work better for me. So how do we get on their level? And telling them that they're going to live longer is not how you do that. It's about, hey, you want to keep doing what you do. How do you do that for a long time?
Right. How do you live better?
Yeah.
Do you think some people, and I sort of want to come back to weight loss and why some people have success and others don't, but do you think overall, and I feel like this is something you experienced, that generally speaking, people who are able to make behavior changes and adopt a new lifestyle have endured some sort of pain themselves or shame, or have seen someone close to them, like in my instance, saw my dad have a heart attack. And it's that event that then acts as like a source of kind of strength or something to hold on to, such that those behavior changes they make stick and they're able to form a new identity.
Yes, I think a large chunk of people are that way, but that also has the ability to send someone the other direction too. Because then they do things out of spite, or they do things. So I do think that plays a very big role. The little bit that I know about neurochemistry, I understand the way the neurotransmitters are essentially, especially dopamine, it's always looking at the immediate past and the present, the immediate past, like what just happened. And it's kind of constantly keeping a checks and balances of the immediate past and what's happening now to regulate and manage like baseline. It's similar with other neurotransmitters. And it's like when you have a big shock to the system, you break that pattern where you're not just looking at short-term and immediate, like an immediate past and present. You do start looking at longer-term past and present. And I look at like my dad's cancer. Could it have been avoided? Possibly. He smoked, and he was a race car driver, so he was in a garage with car exhaust constantly, right? So, lifestyle things. His diet was actually quite good, so it wasn't a huge changer for me. But you look at these calls to action, and like for me, that pivotal point, a Jack in the Box, or learning that I was technically type 2 diabetic. Like some things clicked with me. When I was told I was type 2 diabetic, it didn't change my life. I was like, I'm in my 20s. Who cares if I'm 144 milligrams per deciliter when I'm fasted? I mean, I look at that now and that's scary. But to me then, that wasn't a shock to me. But at that age, what I needed was a peer seeing me, right? And that was a shock to me. And that's something where it's like, now I can regulate and remember that feeling and how I feel now, compared to dopamine in the norm, just regulating what happened 3 seconds ago to now. So it's a bigger impetus to really stake that claim. But I do think that there's people that are not wired that way. I do think that people can have that happen and just keep on doing what feels good to them.
So what would you kind of say to someone who, let's say someone's listening to this and they're overweight, they know that their health is not where it should be, quite frankly, but they've tried various things before and they just haven't been able to make the behavior changes stick, and they end up falling back to their old ways. Do you have any kind of tips or strategies for how someone could approach that and hopefully make some changes that do form part of their lifestyle so that the weight they lose can be sustained?
I typically tell people that have like tried a lot of things to make a list of 8 to 10 whole foods that they absolutely love. And then I usually give them a license to eat as much of that as they want. I know that's not necessarily accurate, right? Like, I mean, if you overeat anything, you're going to gain weight. But if you tell them to list whole foods and things that are not processed, it gets pretty narrow. And sometimes they even have a hard time coming up with 8. I say, okay, well, eat as much of those as you want. The caveat is like, as you eat these and you feel more active and you feel better, like you need to move more too. That usually flips a switch for people because it's disarming them. It's disarming like the restrictive mentality. It is why intermittent fasting worked well for me too. It's because that I didn't feel restricted. So I do also tell people, okay, the next thing is, focus on when you're eating. We focused on what you're eating. Maybe you should focus on when you're eating. And a lot of times that is like a pivoting point for people. Say like, hey, like, why don't you try like taking this break between this meal? Or why don't you try, you say you don't like lunch. You don't want to eat lunch. You're not hungry at lunch. Why are you forcing lunch? Eat breakfast and don't eat throughout the day and then eat dinner. Like there's nothing wrong with that. All the tactics that I use on myself and on others are about disarming resistance so that they feel comfortable and they feel safe. Everyone wants to feel safe, right? Like that's what we want. And when we feel threatened and we feel like our food is our enemy and like everyone's out to get us and like it's just scary, like then you're operating out of fear and you're completely in the wrong operating system.
Quick one, folks. I get asked all the time about buying supplements and getting blood tests. The good news is I've created comprehensive and completely free guides for both. Simply head over to my website, theproof.com, to download them. That's theproof.com. Okay, let's get back to the episode. What are your thoughts on calorie counting? I think this is another divisive one. You'll have, folks like Lane Norton that are very pro calorie counting, at least for the right person. And then you'll have some people that maybe take a position that nobody should count calories and that it leads to orthorexic eating behaviors.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fair thing to say that it could lead to that, but I also think that the dose makes the poison, and also the type of person matters too. I'm the type of person where if I get into calorie counting, I will count every single calorie and it becomes cumbersome. So I feel intuitively eating in theory would be great, except for the problem that we have such hyperpalatable food that is probably overriding our intuition. When you're lighting your brain up like a Christmas tree between all kinds of, hyperpalatable fats, hyperpalatable sugars, not to mention things like MSG that are also increasing the umami effect of food. I don't think there's anything really wrong inherently with MSG, by the way, but we just have to accept the fact that its purpose is to make food taste better. So when you have all these things that are designed to make us eat more, it's really hard to eat intuitively. So I wrestle with the fact of saying, like, you should just eat when you're hungry, because most people would say they're hungry, and that's a hard one. Calorie counting, what I've adopted over the years, however, I have a pretty good understanding of what food contains what. I look at my calories generally over the course of a week. You've probably heard me talk about this. I look much more of like, where am I? Am I in a surplus or a deficit at the end of a week? Because I intermittent fast frequently, I have a fair bit of 2 or 3 days a week where I'm fasting, and I might only get 1,000 calories in those days.
And so you're doing that by skipping breakfast? Is that still how you do it?
No, a lot of times I skip dinner. I do various forms of time restricted feeding. I mean, we can get very nuanced with that, but I feel like the benefits of when you don't eat can be umbrellaed over various times of the day for slightly different benefits. I know Huberman talks about this a lot too. It's like skipping dinner has different circadian cue benefits, whereas like skipping breakfast might have more caloric restriction benefits and might have more energy balance benefits based upon like what deficit you're in during your most active portion of the day, right? So skipping breakfast might make it so that I'm in a much heavier deficit while I'm moderately active throughout the day, whereas skipping food at night is more a biological, like circadian cue type thing to help me sleep, right?
Yeah, and the episode that I did with Courtney Peterson, she actually had a really interesting study that I think you'd be particularly interested in. It was subjects with pre-diabetes, and their blood glucose control, if I'm remembering correctly, was much better when they had more of their food in the early part of the day rather than late before bed.
Yep. Yeah, I typically would recommend that. Breakfast like a king, lunch like a prince, dinner like a pauper. Just eat a big breakfast, on the days. And that's what I do when I'm not fasting. I do typically have a bigger breakfast. Unless I'm filming and I feel like I need to have a little bit more brain. Like when I do eat, I definitely am more sluggish for sure. So with that, I look at my calories generally over the course of a week, because I don't necessarily model my nutrition intake, my calorie intake, based upon how active I was that day. Because I don't think it necessarily matters personally. I think that you have a lot more time to recoup from a workout as far as calories. We know it to be true with protein. We know that protein window is more like 24 to 48 hours. But I also find it to be true with calories. Like if I run 10 miles this morning and I burn 1,500 calories, I don't feel like I need to compensate that 1,500 calories today. I might compensate it tomorrow. And it seems to work just fine for me. And so it's allowed me to just like not be so anal retentive about tracking every single calorie. I know roughly where I am, but I'm okay with the fact that, hey, like I'm in a surplus today. I'll probably be in a deficit tomorrow because I'm going to fast, and so it just allows me to balance out. It's given me a lot of slack. So for the person that's not, doing this as a literal career, I think it's very broken down into their bio-individual traits. Like some people are very motivated by that detail oriented. It's just like, if you ever talked to someone that's a double E, like a engineer, like most of them will admit that they're not exactly good at empathizing and socializing, and they're just wired that way, right? They're very detail-oriented, analytical people. I think how we look at diets is the same way too. And funny enough, like most of the engineer type of brains that I know do really, really well tracking calories. And it's funny, I don't do it too much anymore, but when I would coach people or write plans for people, it was always funny. You could always, like the people that I knew were engineers would always come back to like, hey, I calculated all these calories and I ended up at this, right? And you've probably done a fair share of this. Like
very systems based.
Yeah. So it's just, and if that works for them, that's totally cool. But there's a lot of people that just aren't wired that way. And I think they need to be given, I wonder how much success we would have if just gave them a window and said like, hey, you need to be between 2,500 and 3,200 every day. Would they max out at 3,200, do you think, every day?
What window is that again?
So if we just said, Simon, you can eat 2,500 to 3,200 calories per day, which is random numbers. Do you think you'd, if you were a regular person, would you just cap out at 3,200 every day?
Probably, I would.
Yeah, I think that's the hard part, right? Because it's like, me being who I am now, I would say, oh, well, I had 2,500 today. I'll give myself slack to have 3,200 tomorrow. So it's just like if you give someone a range, do they automatically hit that top end range because food is enjoyment? Or if you give them a range, do they feel more refreshed and they feel less stressed about it?
Yeah, I guess some of this comes back to personality. And I feel like the best approach, and it's why I enjoy these kind of conversations, is to understand that the best approach for each person might not be exactly the same. And there's all these different tools. So it could be time restricted eating, and that could be skipping breakfast, or that could be skipping dinner. It could be tracking your calories. It could be doing a low carb diet. It could be doing a low fat diet, or a combination of any of these. And ultimately, I think I said this before, but what feels the easiest for that person, and is something that they can sustain, that works for them socially as well. All of these things are important.
Or why not being able to have fun with all of them too? I caught some crap for it back in the day when I did it, but I did, like a couple months of vegan, just a few years ago on my channel. And candidly, I felt great. And people, I did lose a little bit of muscle size because I probably wasn't really like good at figuring out how to get my protein. Probably takes time to master that craft really. Yeah, it's, but I felt great, right? And it was, and then I did like a month of vegan keto, which was quite difficult. But fortunately, like my wife got really into it and made delicious food. So that made it totally like doable, like just she went to town. She really got into it, dude. I mean, I felt great, right? So I guess my point in saying that is like, I've never demonized a vegan diet. Like I know there's people in my camp that will, but I leaned into it. And I'm like, how can I help people that like doing keto also do vegan? Because I know the benefits of it. But if the carnivore community heard me saying that, like they'd destroy me, right? They would just find every reason to cut me down. Does that mean that I'm vegan? No, but it means it is, because I've tested it and it works well for me. I've checked that box as it being a viable tool in my toolbox. So now and then I do a couple weeks of vegan. Why? Because it's different and it feels good. And then I'll do keto. Carnivore is one thing where I just don't feel that great. And I tested that too. I really don't. And someone that still eats a fair bit of protein, a fair bit of meat, when I went all meat, I didn't feel good. So that one isn't a tool in my toolbox anymore. But I'll do paleo, I'll do vegan, I'll do vegetarian, I'll do intermittent fasting, and I rotate them out and I have fun with it. And that's just it. I have fun, and it's like we get to look forward to it. My wife will even be like, hey, you want to do an experiment again soon? Like try something different and let's do it. And so we just like take all just dogmatic behavior out of the equation. And I think if other people could just learn, because we can all sit down and we can all look at the literature and we can all say like, there are tremendous benefits to a low carb diet. There are tremendous benefits to a plant-based diet. There are tremendous benefits to a Mediterranean diet. You can have benefits to multiple diets that cross the same categories. Okay, it doesn't have to be just one. So that's just the thing that's frustrating is like, okay, don't deny that the low carb diet has benefits, and there's tremendous research to back it up. But because that doesn't mean that there's not benefits to a high carb diet. Like, people tend to think like, oh, the studies are clear. It's clear low carb is the best. No, we need to stop kind of like pitching diet against diet, and we need to focus on like the benefits of what could work.
I think some of that is we feel like whatever our personal sort of experience or anecdote was, we mistakenly want to generalize that for everyone as the only possible solution. And we're making a few assumptions or errors there. One is where often we make a bunch of changes to our diet, we get some sort of health benefit, and then we attribute that to one thing, right? Like, oh, it was the seed oils, but you removed all ultra processed foods. And then the other thing that I think is interesting is that we miss out on when we kind of think about our anecdote. And I think anecdotes are valid. I think someone's personal experience is valid. And I'm talking more about generalizing that, is for every Simon who, had this good experience, how many Daves and Bretts and James did the same thing but had a bad outcome. And that is where I think coming into looking at some of the data is important. So you think about the anecdote, and then we're looking at what's been tried and tested, and then kind of forming our views from there.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. I think it's a big piece, and it's, unfortunately, that's not sexy to sell online. That's not sexy to talk about in content that, hey, this worked for you or it didn't work for you. And but I think people need to just be able to have fun with it. Otherwise, it's going to be legwork all the time, and you can only prefrontal cortex your way through that for so long before you're going to. What do we always say? We say the military applications that I work with like to say all the time. You never rise to the occasion. You always default to your lowest level of training. And, in a military application, what that means is like you can train someone for that peak event, and that will help. But under stress, you will not rise to that occasion. You'll default to what your baseline level is. And for the military or for special operations, they just make that baseline very high. They train hard, they push themselves, and their default, their baseline is much more than what we are as civilians, right? So they just...
So when you fall, you don't fall too far.
Exactly. And I think that our baseline as just regular Americans, I can speak for Americans, probably not just Americans, but probably everywhere, it's just easier to default back to comfort. It's easier to default to hyperpalatable because it's easy. We're all pressed for time. So until we can kind of learn how to change our default patterns, every time we get stressed, we're going to go back there. Every time it gets hard, we're going to go back there. I don't have an answer on how to fix that. It's...
Well, I think conversations like this help, where someone's confused and thinking, what is the single best approach to nutrition? And then they understand that, well, there's multiple approaches. Find the one that's best for you. I think in terms of where we agree on so much, we agree that you could do low carb, you could do high carb. There's probably some commonalities, and it comes back to diet quality. So are you favoring unsaturated fats over saturated? Are you getting enough fiber? Things like that. But you can do that on a low carb diet, or you can do that in a high carb diet. So I think this information kind of helps people feel more confident, and then hopefully find that higher baseline, as opposed to just hearing different corners of the internet all fighting and trying to say that they have the single best answer for everyone.
People always, you probably hear this a lot. They'll say to me a lot, just tell me what not to do. Tell me what I can't have. And I think people want that because they're like, well, just give me abundance, but tell me what I can't have. And unfortunately, like, as someone that is seemingly orthorexic on the surface, which I'm not, but I seem like it, probably just because I've put a lot of content out. But what should I avoid? And I'm gonna put, I was on Lewis Howe's podcast, and I love Lewis. He asked me, but he's like, hey, we're going to talk about like the 5 or 10 foods you need to avoid to live longer. And I was like, ooh, that's going to be tough. He's like, really? I was like, yeah, dude, like that's going to be tough. I have like 2. have like, maybe we should avoid like hydrogenated oils. We should avoid trans fats, and we should avoid like super hyper processed sugar and maybe heavily processed grains, depending on how active someone is. He's like, you got anything more? I was like, I had to freaking think. I'm just like, dude, not if I'm being fully integrity driven here. Like, I mean, I could pick apart, okay, well, this saturated fat is bad, but there's also a practical use case for them. I mean, the only thing I can't find a use case for is a hydrogenated oil.
Right, because then with everything else, it becomes the dose and the overall dietary pattern. But I think that's helpful information for people as well. Have you come across Roy Taylor's work?
I know some of your... I know you've talked about him. So I know, we talked a little bit on Instagram about this, but I don't know him too well other than what you've talked.
Yeah, I think I've become increasingly interested in his work. He's based in the UK. I think he's diet agnostic, or maybe has been involved in low carb trials before, but relatively sort of dietary agnostic with his approach. And he's been researching type 2 diabetes, sort of metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and trying to understand what's driving it. And also, once someone has it, is it reversible, or can you put it into remission, and how can you do that? And he's done the direct trial, I think, counterbalance, counterpoint, like a bunch of different studies. But what's really interesting is, and this is coming back to our discussion about weight loss, I'm starting to adjust my position a little bit on whether someone needs to focus on weight loss based on their BMI, for example. And I say that because he has this hypothesis, which I think he's proven now, the personal fat threshold. Have you heard of that?
Yes, basically we only have so much ability to store fat under specific circumstances, and
and the key thing being that there's a lot of individual variability. So you can have someone who on the outside doesn't look overweight, but they're very insulin resistant. And then you can have someone who looks very overweight, but they're not that insulin resistant. And what this seems to come down to is that how capable is your body of storing fat subcutaneously? And if you can store more fat subcutaneously than the next person who's the same body weight as you, who is storing less fat subcutaneously but more visceral fat, they're going to be much more likely to develop insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. And it's this sort of fat spilling over into the liver and into the pancreas. So into the liver, which is, as we mentioned before, it's affecting the ability to sort of turn off glucose disposal into the bloodstream from the liver. And then the fat in the pancreas, which is affecting the beta cells and your production of insulin, which again affects your ability to get sugar out of the blood. But so where I was going with that is I've sort of slightly adjusted my position around someone being overweight and obese and how bad it is for their metabolic health, in that I think you really need to understand how much visceral fat you have. I think that's key. And I think waist circumference is a bit of a crude measurement of that, or you could do a DEXA, things of that nature. But the other thing that's really interesting from his studies is, well, two things. One is they've put people on these 800 calorie meal replacement type diets for an intensive period of sort of 8 to 12 weeks as an intervention. These are people with type 2 diabetes. And in the direct trial, I think it was 30 or 40% of people who, over that period, the average weight loss was 15 kilograms. 30 or 40% of those people went into complete remission. They're able to completely reverse that, or I'm not sure if we can say reverse. I think the word is remission. But basically that means that their fasting blood glucose levels return to someone who does not have the levels that someone without diabetes would have, and they're not on any medications at all. And then 40% they try and put people onto a weight sort of maintenance, weight management diet thereafter. And so I think this is another example. There's a lot of fighting around type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance and what's the best intervention. Is it low carb? Is it low fat? But I think his research is making it very clear right now that it's really what can help you lose the most weight, and that this disease is driven by an excess of energy, energy toxicity, we could call it, and build up of fat in the liver and the pancreas.
Yeah. No, we have this abundance crisis, right? Whether it's from nutrition or just cellular energetics. It's that abundance of energy is either going to get stored and ultimately lead to an inflammatory response later on down the line that could impede the effectiveness of insulin. Or if you don't have the ability to store as well, potentially stores as visceral fat, and then you have a different problem, right? So the shorter term problem, I think the shorter term issue with visceral fat is more visible. You can see that. The effect of adipose tissue subcutaneously is a little bit of a longer game. If I were to put 100 pounds of white fat on you right now, in a week, would you have terrible biomarkers? What would your CRP be, right? So I think it's a slower game, whereas I think that visceral adipose could be a different situation. If I put 5 pounds or 10 pounds of visceral adipose tissue on you today, I think you absolutely could have negative effects 7 days from now, because it's so inflammatory. And, it's lipopolysaccharides are just, when you understand how visceral fat works too, and you understand kind of its ability to, in a way, affect lipopolysaccharides that are leaking from the bloodstream in a way to sort of deal with that pathogenic product, you understand why visceral fat is there. But when you have an abundance of it, it's a very immediate problem.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I'm certainly not saying that someone who has a lot of subcutaneous adipose tissue but small amounts of visceral fat would not be healthier if they lost some weight. I think they would. I think they're probably, at least from a metabolic health point of view, are healthier than if they were the exact same body weight but had a lot more visceral fat.
Yeah, and a lot of people that have high amounts of sub-Q fat also have maybe not proportionally high visceral fat, but absolute high visceral fat.
You're wearing a Whoop, and actually I just ordered that. I think I ordered that same color band.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I think they called that ivory or something. But that gets me thinking again about other parts of our lifestyle. So I saw some recent research looking at sleep and sleep deprivation, and they took a group of people and they sleep deprived half of them, and they got 4 hours sleep a night. So really reduced. I think the control group was 8 hours sleep, and the people that were sleep deprived had increased hunger the next day. They also were more attracted to like seductive, very indulgent foods, and they stored more visceral fat.
Yeah, it's the whole sleep category is, I don't think we know nearly as much as we want to know, obviously. I think we're starting to find there's a level of bio-individuality with that too. I asked Peter Attia this. I said, like, hey, we've said 8 hours is the norm for so long. Like, this is kind of an arbitrary number? Like, are there people that can get by with 5 and people, and he said, absolutely. He's like, and there's definitely those outliers. He said, but the regression always comes back to the mean of 6 to 8 kind of being norm. Like, you can have people that really do thrive on 6. But yeah, like arguably once you start getting under 5, you're in very bad territory.
What do you focus on? I know you have 2 young kids, so things have probably changed.
Yeah, it's getting better now.
Do you have a routine?
Yeah, oh yeah. We're almost always in bed by 9. Like, we start their bedtime routine at 9, so we're usually, heads are on the pillows by like 9:15. My kids make it easy because they're up at 6, left, right, or center, it doesn't matter, which holds us to a clock. We don't go out. We don't do that because like we know that if we go to bed at midnight or if we go to bed at 1, we're still getting up at 6. Like, there's no way around it. So it holds us to a nice kind of pattern anyway, which is great. can also be stressful because it's just like, if you wake up in the middle of the night, you don't sleep too well, and you're like, oh shoot, well, I can't sleep in, so I've lost that, So that makes it tougher. But, I really do focus on my sleep efficiency. That's the biggest number that I look at on my Whoop and my Oura, because I feel like we can't accurately measure the sleep stages with our devices yet. I just don't think we're there. Dr. Attia kind of agreed on that. And it's just, but if we look at sleep efficiency, that's a pretty good marker. So I try to aim for 80 to 95% sleep efficiency. Hardly ever get over 95, but.
Right. So you're not really looking at the breakdown of the kind of REM sleep, light sleep, those sort of.
Not too much, because I just don't trust it. For example, like you probably noticed the discrepancies between the Oura and the Whoop. So it's like, okay, clearly we don't know.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons that I wear both.
Yeah, same here.
And then on the days where my sleep efficiency is low on the Whoop, I look at the Oura, and if that's higher, I feel a bit better.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you, because you're literally the only other person I've met that wears both. So like, what do you do? Like, which one do you rely on more?
Whichever one makes me feel better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of what I say too. Yeah. It's like, I'll have, I think today I was actually it's pretty high. I was at like a 92% on my Whoop, surprisingly, but I was a 79 on my Oura. So what I typically do is I'm like, well, I feel like I'm in my 90s. I feel good. So, but what's interesting is I do know that the sleep tracking seems to be a little bit more fine-tuned on the Oura. So I kind of cross-reference with the sleep on the Oura. So I'm like, if I find that my sleep was 90% on Oura and my recovery was really bad on Whoop, then I'm like, okay, well, maybe there's something happening independent of my sleep. Maybe I'm starting to get sick or something like that. Whereas if my sleep is really crappy on my Oura, but my recovery is really high on my Whoop, that's when I do consider, I'm like, well, wait a minute, like maybe this isn't looking at my sleep accurately. Maybe my Whoop isn't looking at my sleep accurately. Because the bottom line is I trust the Oura with my sleep better than I trust the Whoop with my sleep, because I know they've put a lot of money into that. And I just know they're really proud of how dialed in that is. Whereas the Whoop is just great for my real-time strain. I really do like the idea of.
Yeah, I use that every day.
Like, that's great. Like, to just know, like, if you're coming down with something and you're like, well, shit, I haven't done that much. Why am I at a 17 strain? It really encourages you to like look deep at what's going on.
Yeah. Do you adjust your training around that?
Just based on my recovery or my strength?
So I mean, just any of this data, would you ever sort of adjust the type of training you're doing, whether you're going to do that long steady state jog or resistance training?
In a perfect world, I would, but I've got my program in my head, and part of it's just psychological. I love it so much. I just don't want to, like, oh no, I was scheduled to run 12 miles this morning, but my recovery's crap. I'd say I have a threshold. Like if I end up dipping below like 60 or something, then I'm like, okay, I need to and both are registering that. I'm like, something's definitely going on here. Then I might adjust. But then it throws a wrench in so much the rest of my week.
Dude, this has been fun. Thank you so much. I'd love to be able to continue this. I hope that we can sometime do a round two. But if folks listening would like to learn more about what you're doing and the information you're putting out, where should we send them?
I think YouTube's just the safest place. That's where most of my content is. Instagram, Thomas DeLauer. My website is thomasdelauer.com. I've got a best-selling book on Amazon, which is great. It's called Intermittent Fasting Made Easy. It has nothing to do with being animal-based or plant-based. It's purely about how to time things, how to do things, and there's pretty robust sections for vegetarians and vegans in there specifically too, where it just kind of gives tips on breaking a fast properly with that. And so if anyone that's interested in intermittent fasting, that's a great resource.
Well, you're a vegetarian now, is that right? It only took 2 hours.
I'll at least test it for a couple months to see how it feels. Yeah, I'm up for it.
Thanks, man.
You bet.
There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.